Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Mindy Mejia. Mindy is a CPA and a graduate of the Hamline University MFA program. She lives in the Twin Cities with her family and is the author of Strike Me Down, Everything You Want Me to Be, and Leave No Trace. To Catch a Storm is the start of her first series and was a USA Today bestseller. And her next book in the series is called A World of Hurt. Welcome, Mindy.
Thank you so much for having me. I was just saying, this is a huge honor to be on the show. I'm a fan and love to be here. Thank you.
You're super sweet. Well, I got a chance to read both of these books. And it's funny because when I read, I didn't realize I was starting a series. So when I read To Catch a Storm, obviously, I was totally engrossed. And then, and I would say it's interesting. I would say you could read A World of Hurt without having read To Catch a Storm. That, in my opinion. But I do feel like you're going to get a lot more. But it's not like one of those series where if you pick it up on book 2, you're like, where am I and what's going on?
Right.
Because you are dealing with 2 different characters. So tell us, I think we start with To Catch a Storm. Tell us a little bit about this book. And then we'll talk about A World of Hurt, because there's 4 kind of main characters. And I assume the series, you said you're talking in books 3 and 4, the series are going to continue with those 4 characters?
Yes.
Okay. So these are so fun, fabulous. So now I'm all discombobulated because I'm so excited. So just tell us about the, To Catch a Storm and how this started. And I want to know, so literally the woman in To Catch a Storm is like she's a weather expert. She's what do you call her?
She's an atmospheric physicist.
Yeah. So she's an atmospheric physicist. That's like a weather expert in better terminology. So tell us about how this started and how in the world you found out all about what Eve does, because I was amazed.
Right. And actually, so To Catch a Storm for me, usually always starts with character or sometimes a setup. Sometimes I'll see that opening kind of trigger scene. But usually my books do start with character. And To Catch a Storm was no exception. But the character that it started with was actually Jonah, which is the psychic in the book, not Eve, our scientist. I was listening to a true crime podcast. I'm a huge true crime podcast junkie. And there was an episode on psychic detectives on Wine and Crime podcast. If you're interested, it's a Midwestern 2 Minnesota friends who chat wine and drink wine and chat true crime. So psychic detectives, and I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to psychics. I don't know. How are you with psychics? What do you?
Yeah, it seems impossible to believe, and then sometimes something happens and you think, oh, that's kind of hard to explain,
Right. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I am exactly the same. So I think by and large, they're garbage people running easy cons. It's most of what they, people who claim to be psychics, I don't believe are psychics.
Right.
But there are things that happen in our world and we can experience, we can have experiences that we can't explain.
Yep.
I had one psychic experience in my life. I dreamed about my nephew before he was born, before I, had any idea that my sister was pregnant, and just knew as soon as I woke up that I was going to meet this child. I had no idea why or how. I was in my early 20s. I kind of panicked and I was like, oh my God, am I pregnant?
Right.
But I just knew that this child was coming into my life, and there was no way for me to know that. She lived across the country. We weren't that, talking every day or anything like that. So it was, kind of something that stayed with me. And so when I heard this episode about psychic detectives, that was in the back of my head, like, oh, there are things that we can't explain. And maybe there are people who are more in touch with that information than most of us are.
Right.
So I was really intrigued by the idea of writing a psychic detective, and I'd done all sorts of investigators at that point. I'd written like a small town sheriff, a speech therapist, and Strike Me Down, it was a forensic accountant, so I love the non-traditional investigators, so I was really intrigued by the idea of a psychic investigator, but the skeptic in me didn't trust Jonah to solve a crime all by himself. I just didn't see him being that able, to really use the information that he's getting to solve these very complex and dangerous crimes. And so that's
Right.
where Eve came in. I wanted to pair Jonah with his exact opposite,
Which is beautiful, right? She is exactly his opposite. I mean,
Yes, she is. She is. I mean, where he is, intuitive and, very going with the gut and, shies away from situations whenever he can. She is, evidence-based and rational and will just plow into any situation, with all of the facts and, trying to make the best of any situation. So they're complete opposites. But they are both kind of thrown together into Catch a Storm. They reluctantly team up into this kind of unlikely investigative duo to try to solve two missing persons cases that they have each, one of them has each lost someone in their lives, and those cases are connected and they have to work together to solve them. So that's where the first book came from.
I mean, it's so fun. And even like the very first scene where she's up in an airplane, doing her sort of research for her work, and she's witnesses this strange fire, intense sort of flame happen below. And of course, that is the inciting incident of the book.
Mhm.
And then how she figures out what that was, what could have burned that fire so fast since it was raining. And I love, and I also love that you've twisted, you've spun the stereotypical, like the woman is the emotional psychic one and the man is the
Mhm.
scientist, and you've really, and your research is, I mean, the authenticity, and of course the authenticity with which Eve acts, and the decisions she makes are so perfectly aligned with who we understand her to be, that I think that is sort of the trick of writing somebody who's very untraditional, is that you really can't lose track of how they would think about the world or how they would react to things. And I think you do a beautiful job both with Jonah and with Eve, and again with the second book and those two characters. So we won't talk more about To Catch a Storm because obviously we don't want to give any of it away. It is such an enthralling story. But let's move then, because there's two peripheral characters in To Catch a Storm who then become sort of the main characters in A World of Hurt. And tell us about them.
Yes, yes. So when in A World of Hurt, so we are all in the same world. We're picking up the same storyline, really, even before book one ends. We before that epilogue in book one, we pick up in book two. So the two characters that we're following in book two are Max Summerlin. He is an investigator with the Iowa City Police and has been a longtime friend of Jonah's. They were college roommates, just kind of, the computer matched them up in school and became really unlikely friends. And they've been friends. They have a history, and their relationship is a bit strained when we first meet them, but
Yes, right.
it's a complicated friendship, but as that decades long friendships always are, I think,
Right,
there's nuance
right.
there. And so we meet Max is still working for the police when we meet him in A World of Hurt. And then our other character in A World of Hurt is Kara Johnson. She is a criminal, actually. So she was working for the drug trafficking ring that we stumble across in book one. She becomes an informant for the DEA in book two, somewhat unwillingly, but she does it of her own, her own decision. But it's kind of a compromise decision, and we can get into that. And the Max as well is recruited by this DEA task force to take down the remains of this drug empire. So we have another two unlikely investigative duos, in book two that are thrown together. And again, these two are opposites in many ways. We've got a cop and a criminal. Max is suffering from chronic nerve pain from a gunshot wound that he sustained, and so he's kind of hampered by that and dealing with that. And on the other side, Kara has a very rare condition called CIP disorder. It's a congenital insensitivity to pain. So she cannot feel physical pain. And this exists. It's very, very
Mm-hmm.
rare. but it does exist. People who just don't have a sense of physical pain. It's a certain protein that's deformed in their genetic code, and that protein is responsible for letting the pain signals get to your brain. So she doesn't know. She doesn't know if her hand is burning. She doesn't know, if she's been shot, necessarily, other than the pressure of it. So it's a very dangerous condition, actually.
Right.
So we've got someone who's in constant pain and someone who cannot feel pain. And then their attitudes toward the world as well are very opposite too, because Max, as a police officer, is going to put duty ahead of everything. He puts duty ahead of his loved ones.
Right.
Tara would set the world on fire for the love of one person, so they really do become each other's foils in this, and reluctantly thrown together again. But their dynamic is so fun. And I had just such a great time.
I can imagine. I can absolutely imagine. And and as different as they are, they're also so different from the other two. So you can see how these four people kind of create literally a diamond of sort of opposites in different ways. And there is, as you said, Jonah and Max have been friends forever. Jonah, because of his talent, which he's a psychic, but it's not a very exact science, right? So he might feel something, but then he leads them in a direction that he thinks is helpful, but then of course it isn't. And then Max gets in trouble because that's not how law enforcement officers like to work. And, so he's in trouble with his bosses. And as you said, Kara, and like you said, yeah, if she doesn't know she's bruised, she doesn't know she's internally bleeding, she doesn't know if her ankle's broken, she might try to walk on it. Like, it's a very, and she's had a really sort of rough upbringing. I mean, she's scrappy and from the beginning for herself. So
yes. Yeah. And I mean, this condition, CIP disorder, most people don't live past the age of 26, just because it is so dangerous not to feel pain, even though it sounds great on the surface, right? But it's really, really very dangerous. We need that sensation to live, to survive. So when we meet her, I mean, the opening scene in A World of Hurt, she's waking up mid-surgery in the back room of a veterinary hospital, where she kind of has this like off the books deal with the vet there that she'll sew her up whenever she gets hurt. And so she wakes up mid-surgery. She doesn't really care about the gunshot wound that's being, attended to. She's more concerned, was she followed? Is she safe? Can she get away from the situation that caused the gunshot wound? So don't give anything away, but
no.
But yeah, so that's right where we meet her. So right away, that she's not your typical character.
No. So did you know that Kara, so when you wrote To Catch a Storm, did you know that Kara would be the protagonist of the second book?
Yes.
Okay. Because she does emerge kind of, I mean, we don't see her that much. We see some of her, of course, in the first book, but not enough to sort of imagine her fully formed. So when you're doing this, because this is a lot of planning, and obviously you're a CPA, so I also come from a finance background, so I understand a little bit about sort of how those things, how writing and mathematics kind of fit a little bit together in your brain, or something about that. And I don't know if you feel that way, but that seems to be true for me.
I do actually. Yeah. I mean, it's funny, I think you've probably gotten this too, people from like your separate corners of your lives in like finance or writing that they kind of don't understand how the Venn diagram there,
Yeah.
but there is overlap. And I think especially as writers, we're kind of seen as like these kind of free spirit artists, and that's, you can't be that and write a book.
Not really. Right. You can be that and have a lot of ideas, but
Right, exactly. You have to have that left brain sort of architecture, behind it to sustain that narrative, to create, the world. And you were in charge of that world. You're building every block, you're making every piece, every movement. And so it's less of that kind of artist stereotype. And it is more of that, okay, I'm gonna make this balance sheet, and I'm gonna check off all the boxes and make sure that everything ties out at the bottom. There is this kind of strange commonality there.
I agree. I totally agree with that. And I also think that it's part of it's like when you're doing any kind of mathematical equation, you got to make sure you didn't leave any straggling numbers, right? It's the same thing. You drop a hint in chapter 2, it has to pay off. And if it doesn't, then you got to get rid of it. So it's sort of there's something I don't think it's formulaic, but there are formula aspects to it. So tell me this, because it seems like now, especially since you're talking about now 2 more books in this series, which is so exciting. I love that that's going to happen. But tell us, like, when you started To Catch a Storm, you knew it was going to be more than one book,
Mhm,
or when you got,
mhm.
I don't even know if that's true, if that's fair to say. Sometimes things happen in the midst of writing that first book where you sort of imagined it would become part of a series. But how far, when you were sort of imagining the series, how far out are you going in terms of, because these books are so perfectly aligned that in my mind you had to have at least really thought through 2 books when you're writing To Catch a Storm. And I've never done a series that way. I'm hugely impressed, because when I start a series, it's always like, this is a standalone. And then at the end, they're like, no, it's a series. And then you have to kind of go back and be like, okay, what's the bigger
Right,
arc? And
right.
it's like retrofitting, it's like a remodel on the book to make it a series. So that's clearly not the case for you. So tell us, how did you do that? How far out have you planned, and how do you affect that?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And it's intimidating, because I'd only written standalones before this. So the idea of multi-book arcs was intimidating. And the idea of writing about the same characters book after book. For me, I always love my characters, even when they're horrible people, even when they're making
Yeah.
awful choices, I love them and I want good things for them. And so the idea of putting them through trauma after trauma
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
trauma in
It's the
that was
Angela
scary.
Lansbury, it's like,
Yes.
she just like, what woman is around so much death. I totally understand. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it was hard for me to get there for a little while, and this was my way around that was really focusing on different characters within the world. So I do get to leave even Jonah alone in book 2. I guess a little spoiler there, they live. But
Oh, yeah, no. You couldn't have killed him. That would have been, he would have
no, no.
thrown the book across the room. No, yeah.
Right,
Fair.
right. Yeah. So I do get to leave them alone in book 2. I mean, we see them, we get to check in on them a little bit. It was
Mhm.
just kind of fun, to like visit
Yes.
friends when you get to see them. But I did originally kind of think of this as a duet. I thought of it as a 2-book arc, just because I think I didn't have like the confidence to know I could just write this huge series.
Right.
So it was like baby steps for me.
I mean,
So
fair. And I think, it can get a little bit like, you can lose the sort of power of each book when you think too
mm,
big, right? Because
right.
then you're sort of more worried about a larger arc, and it's like, well, then, you know, I think it's sort of a balance. So I think the 2 book has been very effective. So okay, so you thought of a duet, and
Mhm.
then at some point you had to be thinking about either another duet, or how are you thinking about that?
Yes, yeah. So at some point then in book 2, I was talking to my editor and they were very interested in continuing with this. And I'm excited at the opportunity, that we can stay in this world for a while longer and with these
Yes.
characters. So I did kind of leave this very obvious door open at the end of book 2, which kind of will set our path going forward and
Yes.
for the next 2 books. So I'm working on book 3 right
Of course.
now,
Yeah.
and obviously we all are working on the
Right. You're
next book.
always about. I know. I nobody understands you, like promoting one book, writing one book, thinking about the next book. It's just
Yeah, I
yeah,
know. I know, just this constant juggling act. Yeah.
totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've got books 3 and 4 kind of mapped out. I don't know if it would go beyond that,
Hmm.
because I do have other standalones as well that are, in the back of my head, kind of begging to be written. But I do like the idea of this 4-book series.
Yeah, that's so. I mean, it is the setup is fabulous, and the setup at the end of book 2 is, like you said, it's flawless for book 3. If you hadn't been writing a book 3, I think I would have been like, "What's happening? This is all wrong." So you're somebody who sounds like who has a lot of ideas. So and how do you sort of, where do they in your mind, like where do they come from, and what do you do with them when you can't write on them? Because
Mhm.
do you feel like you just let them simmer? Do you write them down? Do they go away? Tell me about that, because I'm a one idea at a time, and at the end of each book, I'm like, that's it. I guess I just wrote my last book because I don't have any more ideas.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh my gosh.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. So how do you find your idea for your next, like, is it like, what's your process then to look for
I
that
mean,
next idea?
it's just a sort of like wing and a prayer.
Yeah.
I mean, usually as I'm finishing up book 2, the book, something
Hmm.
else starts to sort of niggle at me, but and I always, the series I can go back and visit, and I have story. Actually, I think it's easier to find story ideas for existing characters because they're like friends I haven't touched base with, but
Right.
new ideas, like
Mhm.
it is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I really don't have I like the idea that I might have process for now. I don't really. They just sort of show up. So maybe tell me
Yeah.
yours, and maybe I'll get some
Yeah.
inspiration.
No, I think there is a little bit of magic in it,
Hmm.
like, I don't know if you like Big Magic, Elizabeth Gilbert's
Yes.
craft book,
Yeah, I love that. The bird
uh,
that lands, and if you don't grab it, it goes to somebody else. Yeah.
it keeps going on, it keeps
Yeah.
moving, to the next person who can pick up that idea. But I do like to let ideas simmer for a while in my head before
Hmm.
I do anything with them, because that tells me that it has legs,
Yeah.
that I'm going to be interested in it for the months or years that it's going to take me to write it. My
Right.
interest isn't going to fizzle out, and it's something that has, enough layers, enough complexity that you can sustain that for 300 pages. So I do tend to like think of something and I'm like, oh, well, that's an idea. And then it just kind of sits around, and the ideas that don't go away, the ones that keep bubbling back up, that just,
Hmm.
kind of demand to be chewed on more and more. Those are the ones that I know, okay, I'm going to have to write this if I want to get it out of my head.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think there's also something to the idea that, I do sometimes have like what I think is a fabulous idea. And then on day three, I'm like, oh, well, obviously that's not going to work because, there's things you don't think about
Yes.
initially that you
Hmm.
can, all of a sudden the holes in the plot are so big, you can, pull an elephant through one. So it's like, that's another sort of test. So you don't write it, you kind of, I believe there's sort of the sense for some authors that you don't write things down because when you do that, you sort of make them more solid versus letting them percolate in your brain. But other people are like, no, I write every idea down and put it in a folder, so which
Oh.
way, how do you do it?
I tend to just let them live in my head for the most part. I mean, sometimes I'll write something out if I don't want to lose it. But yeah, I usually just let the idea live in my head until I'm ready to sit down and really dive into that world, because it does change. For me anyway, if you write something and then you look at it, months or years later, you could be like, well,
Yeah.
what was this? I
Right.
don't
Right.
even,
This is
you know,
terrible.
yeah, or you're not
Right. Right.
connecting with it anymore.
Right.
Like it's not alive for you anymore.
Right.
I think keeping it in my head keeps it alive for me.
Yeah, it's sort of it's growing organism if it's not solid down on paper. I love that idea.
Exactly.
Can you
Yeah.
tell us anything? I mean, without giving anything away, there's two characters that we're dealing with in book three.
Yes. So our main two characters in book three are actually Max and Jonah.
Okay.
So we are going to get to see these two friends really team up in a way that we haven't been able to see before in books one and two, because they've been off doing their own things. We have all
Yes.
this like history that we know about them and we see them interacting, but they're on their own arcs, in books one
Yes.
and two. And so for books three, I really wanted to bring them together and see them really teamed up and working together. And they are less of an unlikely investigative duo, but they still are opposites in many ways. I mean,
Yes.
Max comes into things with like this cop mentality of like, I'm
Right.
just going to get the job done, XYZ, here we go. And Jonah is still that very intuitive, like not sure how to fit into the world. He's with his abilities, it's very difficult for him to live the way the rest of us do.
Oh
And
yeah, like coming into a room and being bombarded by the emotions of everybody in the room, touching something that somebody else is. I mean,
yes.
and it is so interesting. I mean, I sort of think there are people who have very, whatever it is, some sort of really incredible intuition. And you can imagine it's sort of borderline mental illness, right? I mean, it's because or maybe that's not the right way to say it. Maybe there's just there's an overlap between what it probably feels like to be mentally ill and what it feels
Mhm.
like to have these kinds of abilities. And from the outside, everyone's like he's mentally ill, whereas
Yeah, because it's different from our agreed upon reality. It's
exactly
it's moving in a different direction that other people can't access. And so yeah, I see where
right.
that's an excellent comparison. And yeah, it was interesting to write both of those characters in books one and two, Jonah and Kara, who have these abilities, these kind of
Yeah.
powers almost that seem like a superpower on their surface. It seems
Right.
like, wow, they're extraordinary.
Yeah.
But when you really like get to know that character, when you really dig into it, you realize it's a disability to them to live
Yeah.
a full life.
Yeah, you would not want either of those. I mean, it does sound really magical to be able to sort of, but Jonah lives a very tormented life, particularly
Mhm.
because, there are people that he wasn't able to find. And that
Yeah,
is, you can imagine when you feel like the weight of finding this person is wholly on you because you're
right.
the only person who has this kind of ability or the only person who's still interested in the case. And police in particular, I love that because police are about the least sort of creative, thinker. I mean, they're creative thinkers in that they like follow the evidence, and so they let their, they have to be creative about how they follow the evidence. But they're
Right.
so it's so procedural. It's so
Mhm.
guided by,
Mhm.
and you understand why, of course, like because it's what it is, and they,
It has to be.
outside the box is not where they really can't. You can't try a case based on how somebody felt about something. So,
Mhm.
you understand that, but but it is, and I love the relationship they had in college. The way that they, sort of, and I think the way that basically Max helped Jonah develop his skill because Jonah was talking in his sleep. And Jonah's twin brother is another super interesting. Um, right, that Jonah has a twin brother who's opposite, doesn't have any of this sort of.
Exactly. Yeah, he's got a twin who's like in sales, I mean,
Yeah,
he's
right.
totally,
Right, which
totally
is the
different
last
personality.
thing Jonah could ever do, right?
Of course, yeah. Imagining Jonah trying to sell you anything is just
No,
wild. Yeah.
no, right, no, no, it's so fabulous. So once you kind of, like you said, you came across, in the book, Jonah came to you first, and so, um, in the first, in To Catch a Storm. So do you then sort of, do you have a process for developing a character? Because, it's, or do you just write and they sort of develop as you write? Tell us about that, because as I said, I am so impressed by the depth of these characters and the consistency of them, because I think sometimes you see a character with wonderful depth and then they do something, even something small, that seems out of character, and it just
Right.
pulls you out of the sort
Right.
of story for even momentarily.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I felt that too. Reading certain books where you're like, no, they wouldn't do that. That's
Yeah,
that's not who you built this person to be. And it does kind of pull you out of the narrative. It pulls you back, and you
yeah,
you don't want to be. You want to be immersed and believing
right,
everything as we go.
right, right.
So yeah, I think it's always a challenge for me, that point of view challenge to like really get into the character enough to be able to see things as they see them. And so I research enough about that character to know how they would think,
Mhm.
in any situation. Eve, for example, the atmospheric physicist, I took physics pass fail in high school. It was not my subject,
Well,
teenage me
I'm
to
impressed. What she
understand.
knows, I mean, you must have had access to somebody who's really knowledgeable, or you did a lot of reading.
I read a lot of books, a lot of popular science books, a lot of physics books, and not enough that I could probably pass a physics class, but enough that I knew how she would think. I knew how she would
Hmm.
approach a situation. And there's a scene in the first book where Jonah shows her a picture of the missing person that he's trying to find. And more than seeing the person in the photo, she's looking behind the person to see like the cloud pattern on the grass, because
Yeah,
that's what she's focused on, of course, as
right.
the atmospheric, because she's like, okay, well, I can see what kind of day it was, that's just what her mind goes to. That's what she's looking for. Whereas me, I would look at the person,
Yeah, right,
so
right,
it's
right.
constantly kind of like getting immersed enough in each character to know how they're going to approach this, what they're going to do. And I don't always know that going in. I do kind of
Yeah,
have to feel that out as I'm writing that first draft. So I'm more of a pantser. I can't
yeah,
plot things out because I'm not
me
sure what the
neither.
character will do until
Right,
I'm writing them. Yeah. So
right.
you're the same?
Yes, and I always wish I could plot, but I agree with you that in that if I made a decision for a character I don't fully know yet, it would likely
Mhm.
be the wrong decision. I have to sort of sit with the character and let him or her or them tell me, because I don't know, and sometimes I end up making a decision for them and getting down a road and being like, oh, that's not right.
Right. Yes, you can feel it. You can
Yeah,
feel when it's not authentic to the character. And yeah, I think it makes a better book when you do just trust those characters and trust that they'll lead and you can follow them.
Yes. Well, it's super exciting. So, I mean, everybody, these were back to back, I got to read them. And actually, I listened to Catch a Storm and I thought the Audible version or the audiobook version was fabulous. That just was, fun to do because I mostly read arcs, obviously, and
Hmm.
the audiobooks aren't ready by the time I'm reading. So, and
Exactly.
I love the way they've done, the way that the two covers,
Hmm.
feel totally like they belong together. So I think that's amazing too. So
Yeah.
Mindy, I know you're on Instagram. Tell our listeners where they can find you, so they can follow you and see what all the interesting things you're doing.
Yes, yeah, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, a little bit of TikTok, not too much, occasionally over there. But the best way to keep up with me is probably my newsletter. So if you're interested in what I'm doing, if you want to see my new book covers before anybody else gets to, you can subscribe to my newsletter at my website, which is just mindymejia.com. And I only send it out about 4 times a year because I can't be
Yeah.
bothered to do
Yeah,
it
I
more
know.
than
They're hard. It's this hard thing to keep up with. And for those of
yeah.
you listening and not watching, Mejia is Mejia. It's a tricky one. And I'm super excited. I've actually got copies of both of these. Your publisher was kind enough to send me a second copy of To Catch a Storm. So when we do a giveaway, you will get both books, which is like double fun. And Mindy, this is out August 6th. So this book is still in pre-order, so
Oh,
people
okay,
can
great.
go grab this book before it comes out. Or if you're a quick reader, which I know so many people are, you could read To Catch a Storm first and be ready for the day A World of Hurt is out. Mindy, I'm so impressed. And I think are you also like a full-time working CPA?
Yes, yeah, I work full time for an investment advisor. So I am doing financial and tax planning all day, right in my lunch breaks.
Oh my God, so impressive. Well, this was so fun. I love these books, and it was so fun to get a chance to chat with you. I hope to see you in real life one of these
Yes,
days, Pillar
yes.
Fest or BoucherCon or something. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a huge treat. Thank you.
So fun. Everyone, this was Killer Women with Mindy Mejia, To Catch a Storm and A World of Hurt. So much fun. I really cannot recommend them enough. And I know you won't be disappointed. We will see you next time. Bye.